Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Baptiste. I'm a manager with the Center for Sustainable Energy, and today we'll be talking to you about the City of San Diego's building energy benchmarking requirements, specifically for multifamily properties. Now, if you are joining this webinar and you haven't attended a previous webinar and you don't necessarily represent multifamily, you can still learn a lot from today's webinar. Alternatively, previous webinars that have been focused more on the commercial sector are available on the city's website. You'll get a link to the city's website after today's presentation when we send a follow-up email, but just wanted to give that disclaimer at the beginning in case there were different people attending this webinar. So just taking a minute here, thank you for your patience. Due to COVID, as you guys have probably experienced, sometimes there are connection issues or intermittency problems because of all the people who are using platforms like GoToWebinar. So we are recording the webinar and all of the slides will be made available via the city's website. But if you are experiencing audio issues or have any questions, for those experiencing audio issues, we suggest calling in via your phone and muting your laptop. That is a great approach for troubleshooting. If not, the webinar will be recorded. You can submit questions using the chat feature. So those will get sent to staff and we will have multiple Q&A sessions throughout the presentation. We will try to get to all questions during the presentation, but if you have anything that's specific to your situation or something that you didn't get to ask and think of later, you can always email the City of San Diego at energybenchmarking@sandiego.gov. And then to sign up for notifications, access additional resources, always visit the City of San Diego's benchmarking website, sandiego.gov/benchmark. That's going to be your central resource for all things related to the city's ordinance. So we like to just hear from our poll members. How did you hear about today's webinar? So my colleague Sophie will be getting us started here. So whether it was from a City of San Diego email or the website, perhaps you heard from the Benchmarking Coach program or San Diego Green Building Council or another source, just mark the main source where you heard about this webinar, and then we'll preview the results. And there'll be 5 other polls throughout the presentation where we're getting your feedback. So thanks in advance for participating. So it looks like we've got a good mix of responses. Most of you guys hearing about the webinar from the City of San Diego, but quite a few hearing it from other sources. So thanks everyone for responding and for joining us today. So here is a brief agenda for today's presentation. We're kicking it off with an overview of benchmarking, and then Tony Moore with the City of San Diego will be presenting specific details regarding San Diego's ordinance. And then at around 10 a.m. we'll kick off with an overview of Portfolio Manager, which is the system used for benchmarking, and a live demonstration. So as I mentioned, my name is Rebecca Baptiste. I'm a manager with the Center for Sustainable Energy. Joining me today are Tony Moore with the City of San Diego and Mariah Saldana, also with the City of San Diego. And Mariah is going to be helping us get those questions answered that you're submitting through the chat feature. So if you hadn't heard about the Center for Sustainable Energy, just wanted to take a couple minutes to let you know who we are. We're a mission-driven nonprofit headquartered here in San Diego, and we primarily work in the clean energy and clean transportation space with a simple mission to decarbonize. We have regional offices throughout California as well as the East Coast, and I think now we're maybe at 250 employees with over 50 projects and programs statewide. So if you've ever bought an electric vehicle through the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project and received an incentive, that was actually our team as well. And just as I mentioned, we have 3 primary areas of expertise: clean transportation, the built environment, and technology convergence and demonstration projects. So one last poll before we kick things off. We just want to see how familiar you are with building benchmarking using Energy Star Portfolio Manager, as well as the city's benchmarking ordinance. So Sophie will get the poll started. So just mark how you're entering today's workshop, and then we'll actually ask this at the end of the presentation as well, just to see how people's knowledge and awareness has changed. So just choose one, and then we'll quickly review the answers and keep going. So great, it looks like we've got a really mixed audience here, going from not at all familiar to moderately familiar. Pretty even mix between those. So hopefully you'll learn something here today and feel a little more confident moving forward in your benchmarking process. So excited to get started. And we'll kick things off with understanding what exactly benchmarking is. So for those of you not already familiar with this concept, when we talk about benchmarking a building, we talk about measuring that building's consumption, whether that's energy, water, or waste materials, and inputting that data into some sort of tool. The industry leading tool, and the one that the city's ordinance requires, is Energy Star Portfolio Manager, provided for free by the US EPA. Once your data is into Portfolio Manager, it actually will help you understand and compare your building's performance against its own historical performance in similar buildings nationwide. So it does have capabilities to help you make an apples to apples comparison for your multifamily or other property type to similar property types. Today's presentation will primarily focus on energy, but I just want to let you know Portfolio Manager, while not required for the city's ordinance, can help you track water and waste at your building as well. So this is just a snapshot of the Portfolio Manager tool. Later on in the presentation, we'll actually be accessing the tool, and I'll be doing a live demo for you guys. But as I mentioned, energy, water, waste, and materials can all be tracked using this tool. So Portfolio Manager is a very complex tool that lets you benchmark multiple different types of properties. So whether you're a multifamily property, or maybe you have some residential units in a mixed use property and you have different building and metering scenarios, Portfolio Manager can work for your situation. So not as common with multifamily buildings, but sometimes in commercial, you'll have a single property that has its own building, its own meter, and it's very cut and dry. That building and that meter gets benchmarked. You can also have in property 2 multiple buildings sharing a single meter. That might be common for gas that's serving multiple buildings on a property. And then property 3, where you have a single building with multiple tenants and multiple meters, common in large-scale multifamily properties, where you have all these different meters and information that you're trying to get to understand your building's whole energy consumption. So before we dive into what you have to do, I wanted to take a moment to talk a little more about the business case for benchmarking and let you know about a couple studies and some facts about benchmarking specifically for multifamily. So I'm going to feature a couple of reports here. The slides that will be sent out do have links to the actual reports if you want to know more. So I encourage you to check those out. The first one is WeGoWise did a benchmarking report on multifamily and surveyed benchmarking that was occurring in multifamily properties across jurisdictions that were benchmarking. And overall, there was 4.3% savings across all utilities after 12 months of benchmarking, and 10% savings after 36 months. So again, this isn't necessarily just because of benchmarking. There are some actions being taken, but it did help the properties understand where they were and better take action towards pursuing energy efficiency in their buildings. Additionally, some properties did subscribe to advanced analytics that had provided additional savings. And then the properties that were actually retrofitted with efficiency measures had the most savings, which is to be expected. So definitely benchmarking can really help drive those energy savings and taking action. So another study that was done by Bright Power in Minnesota showed that master metered buildings that were in the treatment group that they studied saved 5% of energy and 30% in water compared to the control group. So these were ones that were benchmarking. And then 9% more of the buildings that were benchmarking participated in electric rebate and incentive programs than the ones that weren't, which drove energy savings. So really, benchmarking is a step to taking action on your property. So as I've been talking about, benchmarking is really just the first step towards action. It helps you understand where you are today so you know how to get to where you want to be tomorrow, especially in today's day and age. You know, taking benchmarking and then taking action on it through pursuing energy efficiency projects can really help address energy savings on your utility bills, and whether that's utility bills for your tenants or utility bills for your own meters. It's also been shown that more energy efficient properties and greener properties can incur higher rental rates from the population. That might be a concept you're already familiar with, but really the benchmarking helps drive those actions that end up saving you money. So talking about a few reasons why to benchmark. You can help increase awareness of your property's energy performance compared to similar buildings, and that awareness really helps lead to action. It also helps you to understand better how to participate in utility-funded rebate programs, and a lot of the newer rebate programs do require you to do some sort of benchmarking on your facility. That also helps increase your net operating income and the asset value of your properties. And even if it's not required, it is a best practice for managing building energy use. So as a best practice for managing building energy use, benchmarking can help answer many, many questions about your property. I've just put a few of the most common up here. So one is what are the impacts of retrofit projects on your energy use? So understanding before and after, say you went in and did an LED retrofit for all your apartments, or installed Nest thermostats, or another type of smart thermostat in all of your apartments. You can actually mark when that change occurred and see the impacts on your overall property energy use. Another popular one that's really good for management is understanding how much energy you use on a per square foot basis, which is also known as your energy use intensity. And then finally, that comparison factor, that understanding if your properties are more or less energy efficient than similar properties across the nation. We'll talk a little bit later of how that apples to apples comparison actually happens by the data you put into the tool. But this really helps you understand how your building is performing against maybe the competition or against other buildings in your own multifamily portfolio. And then just one more survey that I just might be useful for your facility managers. New York City has something called Local Law 84, which is their local benchmarking legislation. And they surveyed over 100 facility managers that were participating and found that over 77% reported that they had changed how they operated their facility because of Local Law 84. Additionally, 75% made a capital investment in new equipment to improve the efficiency of their building as a result of the policy. So again, going back to that benchmarking, leading to action and leading to those energy savings from reducing energy use at the property. So before I hand it off to Tony, just wanted to take a couple minutes to talk about the larger context of benchmarking nationwide. I know we mentioned Local Law 84 in New York, and then we'll head over to the City of San Diego's ordinance. Great. So on this slide, you can actually see a survey of all the benchmarking policies that are currently in effect across the nation. And there are 3 different levels that are denoted here. The first, the green, is only public and commercial buildings. Orange is public, commercial, and multifamily buildings. And you'll note that California is colored in orange. And then purple actually adds on to that benchmarking requirement and has either performance targets or additional actions that are required. So you'll see San Diego and California are both colored in orange, as they do cover public, commercial, and multifamily buildings. But if you or your agency does have properties throughout California, just note that Berkeley, San Francisco, San Jose, and LA also have their own ordinances that meet or exceed state requirements, and those are the ones you would have to comply with in those areas. So on the state of California side, this requires owners of commercial mixed use and multifamily buildings to benchmark properties that are larger than 50,000 square feet, and specifically for multifamily, have 17 or more units. So it's 50,000 square feet and 17 or more units. And we can talk a little more about that later on in determining the compliance. And then publicly benchmarking and reporting those metrics using Energy Star. The more important aspect of AB 802 for you, everyone listening today, is that a building owner can now request aggregated whole building energy consumption data without needing permission from tenants. So there are some privacy thresholds that you have to meet in order to request this information directly from your utility, like SDG&E. For residential properties where there are one or more residential accounts, you need 5 or more accounts of an energy type. So if I have a multifamily building and I have 6 electric meters and a gas, I can actually go to SDG&E and ask them to aggregate all those 6 meters, and they'll give me a total electric consumption for the building, and I don't even have to bother my tenants. So this is really great, and it really helps unlock benchmarking as a possibility for the multifamily sector. And even if you're not required to report, maybe you have a 40,000 square foot building, or maybe you don't have 17 units in the property, you can still request this data. So I really highly encourage you that even if you're not required to report, to pursue getting this data, because it really can help drive savings and building performance for your properties. So before we hand it off to Tony, we just wanted to poll you guys and see what type of building you represent. So commercial, multifamily, both, other, or not applicable. Maybe you don't represent a building, you're a government staff. So we'll just give you guys a few minutes to get that answered. So it looks like we've got a good mix. We've got some who are commercial representatives, so thanks for joining us today. Happy to answer any commercial specific questions as well. A lot of the stuff is applicable to commercial, so thanks for joining today. Got quite a few who are multifamily or both, and then have a few that are other, or maybe not a direct representative of a property, just getting some knowledge and awareness on benchmarking in San Diego. So thank you guys for answering the poll question. And with that, I think we'll kick it off to Tony. And I do know some questions have come through the chat box. So once we get through Tony's section, we will have a pause for Q&A. So Tony, you can take it from here.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. Good morning. I am Tony with the City of San Diego Sustainability Department. My main role in the benchmarking program is basically to provide you support and guidance with your benchmarking efforts. So I probably have spoken to some of you already in the past several weeks. A little background about the ordinance. The local ordinance that became a requirement in February 2019. And so the City of San Diego developed this benchmarking ordinance for commercial, multifamily, and mixed-use buildings that are currently over 50,000 square feet, which we are in line with the State Assembly Bill 802. So why are we here? Basically, we're here to inform you about the San Diego Benchmarking Ordinance, of course, and briefly describe the importance of benchmarking locally here in San Diego, and provide you with information about accessing local resources and the benefits of having a local ordinance. Here you see our climate action plan with the City of San Diego. It was created by the Sustainability Department. Basically, the City of San Diego places great importance on being proactive with eliminating the long-term risk to people and properties within San Diego community due to the changing climate. So the Climate Action Plan goals are consistent with the City of San Diego policies in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and also measurable data and building benchmarking for achieving these goals. So the Strategy 1 goal for the Climate Action Plan relates to energy and water efficient buildings. So one of the goals of Strategy 1 is to reduce residential, commercial, and municipal building energy use. So the first action of the Climate Action Plan calls for residential and commercial energy conservation and public disclosure. So here you'll find some examples of how benchmarking empowers building owners. So for example, with savings, property owners here in San Diego can save up to $200 million through 2030. As an example, a 500,000 square feet building should save up to $120,000. In regards to competitive advantage, energy efficient buildings will see a decrease in vacancies, but an increase in rental rates. For jobs, benchmarking can also have a positive impact on our economy. Benchmarking is expected to generate hundreds of full-time jobs here in San Diego, while at the same time, health issues complaints by employees are 30% less compared to employees in conventional buildings. So through this effort, benchmarking is expected to reduce over 250,000 tons of carbon monoxide in San Diego by the year 2030. So here you see the benchmarking provisions, which most of you are familiar with. The City of San Diego proposed these provisions to our stakeholders and energy partners in the beginning of the ordinance establishment. So covered buildings under the city ordinance includes commercial, multifamily, and mixed-use buildings that are, of course, over 50,000 square feet, including exemptions. And so as a requirement from Assembly Bill 802, the ordinance basically requires annual reporting and disclosure of energy data. So for exemptions, there may be some exceptions. However, if you feel your building should be exempt, you can submit your exemption request via our website, which we highly recommend, or you can just simply give us a call if you have any questions or uncertain about your building, if they're eligible to be exempt or not. So for automatic exemption buildings, with more than half of their gross floor area for the research and development or industrial manufacturing purposes, you basically just automatically exempt. You can still submit a request through our database. I kind of suggest you do that since this is a new ordinance. It's hard to determine if you are automatically exempt every year, so we will have your information on file if you just submit that exemption through our portal from our webpage. And for government buildings, such as state buildings, San Diego County buildings, San Diego Unified School District, and the transit system and so forth, they are also automatically exempt. Again, if you're not sure, you're more than welcome to give us a call. And for those who request an exemption, you must do this annually. It's not a one-time thing. So if you have trade secrets or you're unable to access building energy data from your tenants, or if the building is unoccupied, we ask that you submit your data annually, and just as a requirement as of now. Okay, and here you will see, like a chart or a graph here, kind of guiding you on how to submit your data. So the building owner basically will collect and report utility information for all building tenants using Energy Star Portfolio Manager. So the data will be verified, and there, of course, there's multiple ways you can verify your data. This can basically be used in Portfolio Manager Data Quality Checker. This data quality checker is something we highly recommend you use. It really helps us, and it will help you out in the long run. So our website actually has a PDF of the Portfolio Manager user guide that has the instructions on how to do this. So we do kind of push for you to use that data quality checker. And if you are new to this, it may take maybe up to 2 hours or longer in order to establish an account. If you have multiple buildings, to get set up, if you're already set up in Portfolio Manager, it can take maybe 30 minutes to submit your data. And here's just basically, you'll find the required information that you put into Portfolio Manager. This is basic characteristics of your building. Even if you are requesting an exemption, we ask that you put this information in Portfolio Manager. And on the output information is basically information that the public will see for public disclosure once we have that set up. And here is our San Diego reporting deadline date for exemption requests and data submittal. However, due to the COVID-19 epidemic, we are extending our deadline to September 1st. And in regards to exemption requests, we are allowing flexibility at this time. So there's no rush if you need to request an exemption. If there's any changes or updates to that, we'll definitely put that on our webpage. And here, this is a sample of New York City visualization benchmarking data using a GIS system. This is our goal here in San Diego to have something similar towards the end of this year. The compliance is basically displayed by parcel, so you can compare your building to other buildings and search for certain addresses, and depends on what your goals are. And the data is also available for downloading in an Excel spreadsheet for research purposes. So our goal here in San Diego is to have a user-friendly portal such as this one. And we continually try to update this portal once we have it in place if there are any problems or issues that the public is having with it. So with San Diego aligning itself with the Assembly Bill 802, it helps the city to manage its benchmarking program more effectively. There are local support services that are targeted to the needs of local building owners. So like, for example, while working with building owners who have already submitted their data to the city can still help inform them about specific city and local utility programs that can enable them to identify and pursue other energy efficiency opportunities for their building. And furthermore, the Climate Action Plan funding states that the city will have options for development of locally based commercial benchmarking resources. So we try to have something here so you don't have to reach out to the state. Maybe you can just, give us a call and we can provide you with the resources you need. So basically, a local ordinance can provide multiple benefits to local building owners. So even though the state of California can provide some assistance and resources as a building owner, locally here in San Diego, you can benefit from additional resources from the city. This could be anywhere between like getting assistance with a local benchmarking help center or in-person training, and also maybe down the road have a drop-in center or a technical support center sponsored by the city of San Diego. So better information about buildings operating costs when buying or leasing a property is basically by marketing your building as energy efficient, you can market the property to achieve your rental goals, and there can also be an increase in the property's value. And access to actionable information related to the energy efficiency retro decisions. With access to local building resources, building owners can decide which infrastructure improvements have the most potential for their building. So ultimately, it's also a great opportunity for you to distinguish yourself in the marketplace as being energy efficient and being an energy efficient building owner. So here you see that we do have training resources on our webpage. We do have step-by-step training videos. We have guides for portfolio manager and also for SDG&E data portal. And also we have workshops that set up by SDG&E for energy efficiency classes. And we also have, we don't have it, but it's sponsored by the CSE Center for the ability benchmarking for state and local compliance. It's similar to what you just saw with Rebecca, but there's more information on benchmarking. And if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to email us or give us a call directly, and we'll try to help you out as much as possible. And I hope you find this workshop helpful. And I'm going to transition back to Rebecca.
Great, thanks, Tony. So now a question for our audience, just trying to understand if you have submitted a benchmarking report before. And there are a few options here. Yes, if you've submitted to the state of California or another jurisdiction. Yes, to the city of San Diego. Yes, you've submitted to both. No, or not sure. So it looks like most of you have not submitted a report before or have submitted to the state, but no one's reported to the city of San Diego. So that's really good to know. And we're actually going to show you where to go, whether you have to report for City of San Diego because you're within the City of San Diego's boundaries, or the state in case you do have properties outside of the City of San Diego, maybe in East or North County or in Chula Vista. So we'll definitely show you where to go during the presentation. So thanks for responding. So we did have a couple questions come through that we responded to during Tony's presentation. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of those, and then Mariah will keep an eye on the chat for additional questions. So one of the questions is, who is responsible for reporting? And that responsibility falls upon the building owner. So whoever owns the building is required to file and submit the report with the city. If you have a service provider or energy consultant who typically provides these types of services, they're more than welcome to submit a report on your behalf, but it is the legal responsibility of the building owner. If you have received notices from the City of San Diego about being required to report, but maybe you're a tenant or in a building, or it doesn't really apply to your situation, or you have questions about which buildings are applicable, please reach out to the city at energybenchmarking@sandiego.gov, and city staff will be more than happy to help I update our database and records to make sure we have the up-to-date information for the properties. We did have a couple questions come in regarding campuses, so we'll cover that later on in the presentation. And we'll also cover an additional resource that Tony briefly mentioned, the benchmarking coach program. We provide one-on-one technical support if you have more technical questions. So we'll provide details on that program later on in the presentation as an additional resource for you guys. And then finally, a question regarding how do you determine which buildings are required to report. So if you have multiple structures on your property and they're completely separately metered, you basically look at property by property to see if it meets the square footage and account requirements. Now, if the properties share energy between them, like a gas meter that's feeding two buildings, then you would add up the square footages to determine compliance. So for example, if you had a 25,000 foot building and square foot building and a 40,000 square foot building, independently, neither of them would be required to report. But if you shared energy between them, like a gas meter, you would have 65,000 square feet because you can't break out the energy usage from one building to another. So both buildings would be required to report as a campus. So we'll talk again a little more about campuses later on in the presentation, but continue submitting your questions into the chat box, or if you haven't already, take a look at the questions we've responded to. That might help spur some additional questions. But in the meantime, I will continue on with the presentation, but anytime you have a question, just submit it in the chat box, and we have a couple more breaks for Q&A throughout the slide deck. So before we get started with our live demo, I wanted to give you a little more details about how you get started in Portfolio Manager and understanding the tool a little bit better. So to start benchmarking in Portfolio Manager, I always say you're going to spend the most time collecting your data ahead of time versus actually inputting it into the tool. Now, for some of you, you might have this information readily available. Others, you might have to follow up with different staff members at your organization to understand how your buildings are metered, what your meter numbers at the property are, and other different details like that, so you can submit an accurate report. So we'll actually go through in a little bit a data collection worksheet that helps you understand exactly what information you need about your property. But at a high level, you'll need your property information. So that's the primary function, the location and the year built, which can be an estimate if you don't know the exact year. You'll enter property data, gross floor area, and specific use details for your property type. So the use details listed here are common for an office property. Residential multifamily housing has other specific use details that we'll go through in the demo. So I'll talk a little bit more about those later. And then your energy bills. If you're syncing with SDG&E, you don't actually need all of your energy bills. You'll just need your latest bill if you have to validate a meter. That usually happens when you're submitting an aggregated request for electric, but you only have one gas meter at your building. You will have to provide the information from your last bill. So that'll be the meter trio, your account number, meter number, and last bill amount. We'll talk a little more about that later. But for the most part, the main thing you need to know is what the meters are at your property and how your buildings are metered, especially when it comes to understanding which buildings are required to report and how much square footage is counted towards reporting for compliance. So I also wanted to touch on the Energy Star score for multifamily. This is not required for compliance, but it is something that you might find your property is eligible for. So this is a score from 0 to 100, where 50 is the average. It takes into account all of your use details, weather, and other property attributes to come up with a normalized score of 0 to 100. It does take into consideration on-site generation, and you are required to report solar generation data for your properties. If your property has 20 or more units and they earn a score of 75 or higher, meaning you're in the top 25th percentile of performing multifamily buildings that are benchmarking, then you're eligible to apply. Again, it's not required for compliance, but it's something that you might want to apply for. Quite a few large properties have done this. TIA, Craft, USAA, quite a few large multifamily firms have applied for Energy Star certification for their buildings, and over 90% of Americans do recognize the Energy Star logo and symbol. So it can just be another differentiating factor for your property when tenants are looking to rent. I also wanted to take a minute to talk about why energy use details are important. For this example, it's office, but the same thing applies for multifamily, and we'll get into their details in just a minute. But the things like operating hours, number of workers or computers in an office setting, number of residential units in bedrooms in a multifamily setting, all can impact your Energy Star score. So for any energy use intensity, which is again is your energy use per square foot, there are a range of expected Energy Star scores. In the two examples we have in the right-hand corner, you'll see building A and building B both have an identical energy use intensity, which is 225 kBTU per square foot. However, building B has a higher Energy Star score. And that's because building B has more operating hours and more workers, and so it's expected to use more energy than building A. They both perform better than the expected energy use intensity, so both of their scores are over 50. However, building B gets a higher score because the difference between its expected energy use intensity and actual energy use intensity, that 314 compared to 225, is much greater. So that's why your energy use details are important, and we definitely encourage you and require that you make sure those are up to date for your properties. So I wanted to talk about the campus scenario and how you should add a multi-building property. So we're going to go through this now just for the use details and kind of setting up the property, and then we'll revisit this concept later on in the presentation when we're talking about using SDG&E's data request portal. So this mostly applies to multi-building, multifamily properties. You can also use this example if you do have multiple commercial properties that have to be benchmarked. However, there are only certain properties that can do scenario 2. So you would only be able to do scenario 1, where you benchmark each building individually and create a parent property. So we'll talk about that a little more when we get to the next scenario. But in this instance, we have an apartment complex that has 250,000 square feet and 250 units. So in scenario 1, we would benchmark every building on the property as well as the parent property. So the parent would be the apartment complex that covers all of the buildings that are on site. And then the children property are each of those individual buildings. So you'll see here, our apartment complex has 4 separate buildings, each with varying square footages and number of units. So on building 1 and 2, they're required to report no matter what. They're over 50,000 square feet and they have more than 17 accounts. Building 3 is under 50,000 square feet. So even though it has more than 17 residential utility accounts because of 45 units, assuming they're all separately metered, it's not required to report. Building 4 is very small, only has 5 units for 5,000 square feet, also not required to report. So technically, you only need to benchmark building 1 and building 2 currently under the city or the state's requirements. However, you should keep in mind that lots of ordinances throughout the nation lower their square footage thresholds over time, and that is something City Council has expressed interest in doing in the future. So we recommend you benchmark if any of your buildings are required to report, that you just go ahead and benchmark the entire property, because setting it up now will prevent you from having to reset it up later. That way, if the square footage threshold were to drop to 40,000 square feet, you're already covering building 3. As policy and requirement aspect, it's going to be easier for you if you just go ahead and benchmark your entire property, even if a couple of your buildings aren't required to report. And this is especially true for garden style apartments. Now, if you're looking at it from a best practice for managing energy use, it's also going to be very beneficial for you to just benchmark all of your buildings versus trying to determine which meters go to which building and which buildings don't need to report, and just assuming they all need to report. So few details that are summarized below. We have a parent property and all the children property that are getting benchmarked. The buildings can be separately metered or share meters. If they share meters across the building, like a gas meter that's feeding all 4 buildings, you would actually benchmark that at the parent property level. Similar, if there's solar generation that's feeding into all of the buildings, you would benchmark it at the parent property level. But if the solar's only tied to maybe building 1, then you would benchmark it at building 1. And then we did discuss if all 4 buildings are separately metered, technically buildings 3 and 4 aren't required to report, but we really highly recommend you just go ahead and benchmark your entire property. And then use details would be entered for this example in scenario 1 at every building level and combining them all and rolling them up at the parent property level. So it's a little more complex to set up on the detail side, but at the end of the day, you have all your buildings set up and they're also all separately benchmarked. This also helps streamline things in the SDG&E system, which we'll talk about a little later. But this can take a little more time initially because you are benchmarking all of those separate properties. The alternative is you benchmark your property as one site. Now, again, this is a special approach that only applies to certain property types that can certify as a campus. So for example, if you were an office building in this scenario, you could not do scenario 2. However, multifamily building could choose just to create a parent property that's 250,000 square feet and 250 units and include all the use details, all the meters, everything for all the properties in that main property. So you don't need to create multiple buildings in Portfolio Manager. All the use details are entered with this one property and the solar generation would be at this one property. So on the Portfolio Manager side, this makes it a lot easier for the data entry. But when you go to SDG&E, and again, we'll talk about this a little more later, you will have to do extra work in the SDG&E portal if you have multiple service addresses at your site for each building to make sure you're actually getting all of your energy data aggregated. So again, this is a little complicated. You'll get the slides. If you do have questions, we definitely encourage you to reach out. There's no right or wrong way. Either way is acceptable in Portfolio Manager. There just are considerations for how you're going to submit a request in SDG&E system based on how you set up the property. So now we'll actually dive into Portfolio Manager and I'll actually demo creating a test multifamily property. And then we'll come back to our slide deck at the end to go through SDG&E's data request portal. So we should be able to see Energy Star Portfolio Manager. But before I get started, just want to check in with Mariah. Did we have any questions come in?
No, not yet.
Okay, great. So again, guys, you can submit those at any time and we'll continue pausing throughout the rest of the presentation to answer those questions for you guys. So this is what Portfolio Manager looks like. And let me actually just make this a little bigger for you guys so you can see it a little bit better. This is a benchmarked property that's an office building that we've already done. So just want to show you kind of what the finished product looks like before we go into setting up the property. So if I click on my property that I've benchmarked, you'll see that I've put in my address. I have the year built for my building. I have different energy metrics over here. for my property based on the data I entered, and I can actually see my improvement in my building's performance over time. Now, this sort of dramatic improvement isn't really realistic. It's just based on the dummy data I uploaded. But you can see we originally went from an Energy Star score of 60 to one of 95. So that means I'm in the top 5% of buildings. That also means up here, I can apply for Energy Star certification and would actually provide me more details. If Energy Star certification is something you're interested in, there are currently considerations based on COVID and how that's impacting energy use, whether increasing or decreasing energy use at properties. So if you have a question and you think you're eligible for certification, definitely do not hesitate to reach out. We'd love to get more properties certified. There's no cost to apply. You just have to have a professional engineer or architect validate your application. So if you have those people on staff, there will be no cost. Otherwise, you just have to pay those professionals a fee to certify. Again, not required for compliance, but we would love to see those who are on the higher end, pursue the certification and get recognized for their performance. On the details tab, we actually can see all of the details we've entered for our property. So again, this is a preview of office. When we set up our own property today, we're going to be doing a multifamily, so these exact items will change. But one of the great things about Portfolio Manager is all of these items in blue, you can actually hover over and click, and it will take you to the definition in the EPA glossary. That's really helpful, especially for gross floor area. There are things you should include and not include. So it's a really great tool to help guide your data entry as you're going throughout the program. On the left-hand side, you'll also see that we have a standard ID. So we'll view this real quick. That's not working, so we'll click edit. We have a San Diego building ID number for our property. So you're probably asking, how do I know my building ID number? Well, that's a great question. You would actually go to the city's website, and under what's covered, you can actually either check out the building list on this side or the benchmarking map to put in your address and pull that building ID number. So just for example, we'll just choose this property right here. You'll see that the building ID has been assigned for 5505 Balboa Avenue. Now, please keep in mind that if you have benchmarked your property and don't find your building ID number here, that doesn't necessarily mean you weren't required to report. It just means that the city needs information, more information on your property. So if you don't have a building ID number already assigned, or perhaps you have one number, but you actually need two because you have two physically separated buildings, please reach out to the City of San Diego. They'll be happy to work with you to assign a building ID number for your property to get that submitted. And we'll show you how to add that when we go through the demo. Finally, the energy tab actually will track your energy use data over time. So you'll see that we just have electric at this property, and you can see a graph of the energy use details. So once you've entered all of your data, you'll see a graph here as well as all of the meters listed. If you're setting up individual meters because you own all of your meters, we recommend you use your 8-digit SDG&E meter number. If you are syncing with SDG&E, they will actually create a total gas and a total electric meter for that aggregation, and they will upload the data for you, so you don't need to create those meters. So this is kind of the end product of what it all is going to look like. If you ever get lost, you can just click the Energy Star Portfolio Manager logo, and it will take you to the home page, the My Portfolio tab. Now, before we get started adding our test property, I mentioned earlier that you need to collect some data about your buildings. So to do that, we're going to just Google the data collection worksheet portfolio manager, and it'll actually be the first result. It's usually the first or second result. And we'll click to access the worksheet. And then we'll pick our country and property type to get started. So for most of you, you'll just be choosing your primary property type, which is multifamily housing. If you do have parking that is tied to the building's meters or parking structures, you will need to add that use so you can get those details. And then maybe you have a mixed use property. In those cases, if you have significantly different uses, like the first floor is all retail and then you have residential on the next 3 floors, you need to separate out that retail use. So you would just select whatever that additional use is and click and find it, for our example, a retail store. And that will prompt you to add additional information about that use type. In our case, we're not going to do the retail. We'll just focus on multifamily housing and parking. And if you're an office building, you would just select office or medical office or whatever property is most applicable to your situation. So we'll click Look Up Required Data and scroll all the way down and click Create Word. This will actually create a fillable Word document that'll allow you to input your information. So let me make this a little bigger for you guys. Again, hyperlinks in blue will take you to the EPA glossary definition. So if you have any questions, you can always click that. And then you'll provide information for your property. Note, you don't need to input irrigated area for these purposes unless you have a specific outdoor water meter and you want to track your water use intensity for your irrigation. Otherwise, you'll leave that blank. Occupancy is another common question. For multifamily properties, this would be your average rental rate for your property. So if you always have a 5% vacancy, you would put 95% occupied. Number of buildings. This is really important. For the main parent property, you would add up all the buildings that are the children properties. So in our example earlier, we had 4 children properties, so you would put 4 here. But when you're benchmarking each of those individual buildings, you would just put 1 because that building is an individual building. And we'll talk about that a little more once we get into the tool. Next are the multifamily housing uses. So this is really important in getting an accurate score. Number of bedrooms should be pretty straightforward. Total number of units, again, pretty straightforward. And then you're going to break out the units based on if it's low, mid, or high rise. So you can click on the link to get more details, but basically you would add up for low rise, the units that are on floors 1 through 4. For mid rise, the units that are on floors 5 to 9, and anything 10th floor and above would be on the high rise line. So all 3 of these should add up to your total number of units. Again, very highly recommend you filling this out and trying to get as accurate information as possible. Unlike other property types, these are very unlikely to change over time unless you're doing some active construction. So multifamily properties have it a little bit easier. Offices have number of computers, number of workers, that number of operating hours that do tend to change more frequently and should get updated over time. But for multifamily, these tend to not change. There is additional information you might find helpful to check. There again, you can click on the links to get information on each of these. We think that it's helpful to check it, but it's not required for compliance. So resident population type, if it's maybe a HUD property, percent that can be heated, cooled, number of laundry hookups, that information actually gets aggregated. And when EPA does their periodic updates to the Energy Star score. Based on information and energy trends, they may choose to make these required in the future. So I would recommend you just go ahead and fill them out if it's readily available. There's a definition for multifamily housing here, basically saying 2 or more units. But if you have specific questions, you can look that up. And then going to parking, you'll see that you can break out your parking based on open parking lot, partially enclosed, completely enclosed, and supplemental heating. Now, in these cases, you really have to think about how the parking is tied to the building meters. If they're completely separately metered, you don't need to include the open lots, but if you do have a completely separately metered large parking structure that's over 50,000 square feet, you still need to report that as part of your campus per state and city requirements. The EPA guidance will say something a little different, but parking structures are required to be reported. If you have questions on that, definitely reach out. But for the most part, whatever building you're benchmarking, if it's feeding parking lot lighting or maybe an elevator for that building meter and they're tied together, just benchmark it at that property. And if you're benchmarking at the parent level, or maybe it's just a master meter that's feeding the parking, you would just put it in at the parent level. So again, this is just simply square footages, and supplemental heating here in sunny San Diego, that's not a thing, so you would put no. In a rare case, maybe there is, but most of you guys will be putting no for supplemental heating. And then there's links to the definitions for parking. Finally, meter information. Really what I recommend, you don't need to do all of this, but I would recommend you have a list of the buildings and the meters of the building and what type of meter it is, and the account number. So the building service address, the account number, the meter number, 10-digit account number, 8-digit meter number. That way, even if you're having SDG&E aggregate, you have a way to verify that all meters are being captured in your request. That's really important because I've come across cases where we've had multifamily properties come in with a score of an Energy Star score of 100, and they were built in the 50s, 60s, and there's really no way they could have that type of score, especially without solar generation. And the problem was they weren't capturing all of their energy use data. So very important to make sure that you have all that information gathered if you don't already, so that when you do submit or try to add your energy data, you have that information available. So again, this is a great tool to help you guide your data entry, and it can be completely customized to your property type and situation. Just fill out the data collection worksheet form. Here you'll see we already have ours filled out. So we'll be going through this next. But before that, we'll go ahead and I think a question came in, Mariah.
Yes. Carol is asking if you can also cover the design project option and the benefit.
Yeah, so the design project option is for mostly for architects and designers who are working on constructing a building and they want to see what Energy Star score their building is projected to receive. That's not really required for any sort of compliance. One of the exemptions for the ordinances are you have to have a certificate of occupancy. So if you don't have that, you're not required to report. We're not going to cover that in this presentation, but if you have additional questions, I encourage you to reach out to the benchmarking coach, benchmarking@greenbizsd.org, and we'd be happy to talk to you more about that specific feature. Any other questions?
Not at this time.
Okay, great. So now we'll get started adding our multifamily property. So again, once you create an account, this is your home page. And when you first start, you won't even see anything in this table. So we'll go ahead and click Add Property. And we're going to add the details about our multifamily property. So I'm going to choose multifamily housing. And I'm going to do the property as a single building. If we have time, we can show you how it looks if you're doing a campus. And then if you do have more than 5 buildings you need to upload, there is a way to spreadsheet upload properties to Portfolio Manager. It's much more complex, and probably it's faster if you have under 10 properties just to do it manually. But if you do have a significant number of buildings on site and you're just like, I don't want to go through this dialogue like multiple times, there is that spreadsheet upload template that is available to bulk upload both properties and meters to your property. So if you are interested in that feature and functionality, definitely reach out, benchmarking@greenbizsd.org. We'd be happy to help you get that started. But for most of you, we would recommend going through this process because it's less likely to make a mistake when you're creating your properties, because it guides you through every step of the way. So properties construction status, everyone's going to be choosing existing. Design project, that's what we were just talking about. You just want to understand the energy efficiency of the design. So we won't be choosing that one. We'll actually be choosing test property for our building. And this helps Portfolio Manager just know that this is an actual property. Don't use this in calculating any metrics, overall aggregating for building performance and trends. So I'll click Get Started, and we'll put in our information about the property. So just give me a minute here while I get this filled out. So again, our property was built 1970, gross floor area 200,000 square feet for all of the buildings in our property. Remember, I'm doing one single property for everything. So I'm just adding all those floor areas together. Occupancy, we run a 10% vacancy rate at our test property. So I'm going to put 90%. Typically, we just say this is the average of the year that you see, or average trend over time. This doesn't impact anything other than your eligibility to receive a score. So it's okay to use a rough estimate here. You can update this over time, but I really recommend you only come back and update this if you have a significant change, which most of you won't. You can skip the photo. And then there are certain situations where you're going to check the box and it'll give you additional prompts to break out additional uses at your property. So that would include energy tied to the buildings for parking. So we can go ahead and check that to demo that today. If your property has a heated swimming pool, if your property has one or more retail stores, so this is very common if you're in a downtown area and the first floor of your building has retail stores or restaurants, and then my property has nursing assisted care units. For the most part, especially for multifamily, you're not going to be adding different uses. For office properties or commercial buildings, really you only break out a use if it has significantly different operating hours or functionality than the main property type. So if you just have a little cafe, you don't break that out. But if you have like a 10,000 square foot cafeteria, then you would break that out because it's definitely using different energy and probably open different times than the rest of your property. So there's guidance as well to help guide you, but the rule of thumb is the less is the better because it's less to maintain. And we can go ahead and click the swimming pool. I know probably a few of you have a heated swimming pool, so we can see what that looks like. We'll click continue and we can see the basic details we just entered. If you made a mistake, you can click edit and update it. Anything can be updated at a later time. The only thing you can't do is move meters between buildings. So we definitely recommend if you are setting up individual meters, make sure it's at the right spot. We also recommend that you just have exact data when you're getting started versus using estimates or marking things as temporary values, because it's going to end up creating more work in the end for you to go back and update it. Scrolling down here, we'll see our building use. this is where we enter all of those different details. You'll see that you can use a default and it'll estimate based on your square footage. But that is not something you can do if you're interested in a score, and it's not something the city recommends you do because the defaults are probably not correct. So as you can see here, my 200,000 square foot building, they're assuming I have very large floors. But what if I have a tall, skinny building and I actually have, you know, only 250 units, but only 100 are low rise, 100 are mid rise, and 50 are high rise. I've got really big units. That's why you really want to actually put in current details. You'll see on the right hand column current as of. Later on I'm going to show you where you can go update this data, but for multifamily specifically, this isn't really going to change once your building's built. So it's kind of set it and forget it. I just recommend every year when you submit a report, you just come back, take a quick glance, make sure everything's up to date. Number of bedrooms. So for 250 units, we actually have let's say 350 bedrooms, quite a few 2-3 bedroom apartments. And then for all of these, I'll just quickly demo what the options are so you can see. Resident population type, if it's dedicated, student, military, or special type of housing. Government subsidized, we're not subsidized. Number of laundry hookups in all units. So we'll just say we have laundry hookups in all units and 0 in common areas. And then percent that can be heated and cooled. So based on all of your units in your common areas, if everything can be heated and cooled, you'll say 100%. If it's everything can be heated, but you know there's no AC, then you can change this percentage. Again, not used for Energy Star score currently, but if you want to keep track of that, you can. For the pool, it'll ask you the approximate pool size. So you can put recreational, short course, or Olympic, or use a default. I'm going to put Olympic because it's a pretty big pool. Location of pool, indoor, outdoor. We have an outdoor and it's used 12 months of the year. And just so you know, months in use is the months that it's open, not just the months that it's heated. So keep that in mind. Parking use. So for my 200,000 square foot property, we have 25,000 square feet of open parking. And then we actually have a basement where we have, let's say, another 50,000 square foot of parking and no partially enclosed. And then there's no supplemental heating. So as you can see, me having my theoretical use details ready to go makes this a very quick process to enter. So I really recommend, again, use that data collection worksheet, get your information up front, and then continue on. We'll click Add Property. And now we see our property is set up. Now that our property is set up, we can actually go to the Details tab and review all those use details we just entered. If I made a mistake, you can just click I want to under the action menu and click correct mistakes. It will overwrite your existing entry. If maybe a couple years down the road, a use detail changed, you can click update with new information, put a new date, and change that use detail. On the left-hand side, you'll see that portfolio manager automatically assigned us an ID number. That's for the portfolio manager system. We still need to add our standard San Diego ID. So to do that, you just click edit after you found your ID number on the city's website. Scroll down to San Diego building ID and put in your building ID number. If your project's LEED certified, you probably already have a LEED US project ID number. And if you're a HUD property, you probably are already benchmarking, but you can put in that HUD property ID. Click Save. and you'll see a green message that you've successfully updated the identifier. Throughout Portfolio Manager, whenever you try and complete a step, you'll see these green notification messages. So once you complete a major step, you should see a green box. If you don't see a green box, just double check you clicked everything to make sure your information went through. Now that we've benchmarked our property, we're going to add our energy details. So some of you may already have energy meters, and if you do and you want to sync with SDG&E, you just need to update those meter names to your 8-digit SDG&E meter number. If you happen to own all your meters, especially for the office people attending this webinar, you can add your individual meters in their meter numbers. Otherwise, if you're doing an aggregated data request, with SDG&E, you don't need to do anything here. We just highly recommend that you get an Excel spreadsheet and have your service addresses, your account numbers, and meter numbers for the SDG&E data request portal. We'll click add a meter just so I can show you quickly how this gets added. And we'll demo a grid meter and a solar meter. So remember, if you do have solar generated on site, you do have to track that in addition to syncing with SDG&E. So we'll go ahead and get started. And for my SDG&E meter, remember, it's good to update that name to your 8-digit SDG&E meter number beginning with 0. You can mark the units. Date meter became active. You really can put any date here, but it needs to be at least the date of when you first have energy data. I always recommend the year your first reporting, but if you have historical data, you can go back further. You can also update this date at any time. You might just see an error message if, for example, I put January 1st, 2017, and my first meter entry is until March. It'll just tell me, hey, you have a meter, but you don't have entries for 2 months. Doesn't cause any issues. Might look a little intense with the error messages, but don't worry about that. And if you have any questions, you can reach out. But for the most part, just put the year for the first year you're reporting. You can track old meters, but most of you will just leave this in-use checkbox checked and the date meter became inactive empty. Enter as delivery is for like propane or diesel or different things like that. So most of you aren't going to have those types of meters. And then if you are adding your SDG&E meters, I always recommend that you also add a custom ID called account number and actually put in your 10-digit SDG&E account number. It just gives you an easy place to have it stored. For electric solar meter, really you just need to update the units and when it became active and click create. And then here's where you can add data, but I always skip this step and do it later just so I can get those meters set up. So I'll click continue. And then you want to make sure that you have all the meters that are at your property if you are doing this process. You'll check that these meters account for the total energy consumption at the property and click apply selections, and we'll get that green notification message and we'll see the meters. For our electric grid meter, if I was coming in here and I wanted to add manual entries, I can just click in here and put a start end date and the usage. Cost, demand, and demand cost are not required for compliance, so you don't have to fill those out. If you did need to update your meter name, you just click basic meter information and can update the name here and just be sure to click save changes. And then if you don't want to do it manually because you have a spreadsheet or you want to track it in a spreadsheet, there's actually a spreadsheet template. So if you look here, you can click that and it will give you a template for that meter type. So this is an example for electric, what it looks like. So electric, solar, and gas all have different templates, but you can use this on a meter by meter basis. I recommend doing this only if you have a couple of meters and you also want to track cost and demand data. We'll talk about that a little more later on. But for us, we already filled it in. So if you do only have a couple meters and you're tracking it manually, you can just copy and paste it into Portfolio Manager, and all those entries will be added. And don't forget to click Save Bills. And a good way to make sure your bills were saved, green notification box, and the last update date will be filled in. If you are confused by what I just did and this is something you want to do, again, there are instructions in the FAQ that show you how to copy and paste. You can also just do manual data entry or actually navigate to the file on your computer and upload the file to get the information added. Again, this is only if you're doing manual meter entries, specifically for people who want to track cost and demand information. If you're syncing with SDG&E or have a ton of tenants, you can't get cost and demand, but you can get that aggregated consumption directly from the utility. Lastly, now that we have some meter information, I can show you where we'll report. In our case, we're going to get an error when we try to report because I've told Portfolio Manager I have a solar meter, but I haven't given any data. But we'll go ahead and just demo that so you guys know where to go. So once I've done benchmarking my property, either I or SDG&E has uploaded my energy data. Before I report, I need to go to the Summary tab and run what's called Data Quality Checker. So you click Check for Possible Errors, and you're going to choose the year ending for whatever you're reporting, which this year you're reporting for calendar year 2019. So you want to make sure this says December 31st, 2019. And click Run Checker. So you'll see I got a red stop sign because they're not 12 months of data for my electric solar meter. Anything that's in yellow you can probably ignore, but you might want to take another look at. Anything related to water or waste are definitely fine to ignore. Stop signs need to be addressed before you submit your data. We'll go ahead and submit our data, even though we did get a stop sign, just so you guys can see what it looks like. And then we'll go back and talk a little more about SDG&E. So on the City of San Diego's website, if we go to the main page, sandiego.gov/benchmark, you'll actually see a link that says Submit Data. And here it just tells you how to submit your data. Now, if you are an exempt building, you filed for an exemption, you received an exemption from the city, you still need to benchmark your building characteristics, but you don't need to do anything with your energy. And you would choose this second option, Submit 2019 Exemption. So it's just going to update your building characteristic data. Otherwise, you want to make sure you're submitting your 2019 energy data. So there are two links here. Make sure you're clicking 2019 unless you also are wanting to do a report for 2018. So we'll click the link and we'll get lots and lots of details. You can go ahead and scroll down and there's just a couple things you need to fill out. If you're a third-party consultant, you should select that you're submitting on behalf of somebody else and choose that contact. That way we get their information into our database. And then the time frame will be selected for you. So all you need to do is make sure it's the correct year. So we got 2019 here, so that's correct. And then we can select the number of properties. So one of the things that's really helpful if you have a lot of properties is actually you can group properties and submit all of them in a group at once, or you can submit them one by one. It's really your preference. We're just going to do our one test property from today and click Generate Response Preview. Oh, I didn't, I'll just put myself. Here we go. So right now, a preview has been generated. Your report hasn't been fully submitted until you receive a confirmation email from Portfolio Manager that your report has been submitted. So in order to fully submit your report, you have to scroll down and see the data request. So you'll see here that I generated a response preview, but I have a yellow caution mark because metrics couldn't be generated. So we'll go ahead and just force this request. But in your case, if you do see this and you don't see a green checkbox, don't proceed. You either reach out or run the data quality checker again and address any issues that are found. But assuming ours is okay to submit, I'll go to I want to send response. We'll ignore the error, but if you do get to this page and you have an error, please address it. Do not submit. Assuming you have everything correct and there's no errors generated, you'll click send response. You can choose people to receive a confirmation email, either their contact in Portfolio Manager, or you can add their email address. You will choose Excel, so you get your data reported in an Excel document, sign, and submit. Then you'll see a green notification message that your thing has been submitted and receive an email, and that's your way to know that it was actually submitted. You can also reach out to City of San Diego, but if you did receive that email from Portfolio Manager with your report attached, it has been submitted to the city. So I know there's a lot, and this webinar will be posted for you guys to refer back to. Also, on the submit data page, we actually have 5 training modules. Module 4 is coming soon, but there will be 5 of all of the different steps to submit your report. So maybe you just forgot how to do the data quality checker and submit your information. You can just click that video, and it's a 10-minute video, and get a refresher on what you need to do. There's also a Portfolio Manager reference guide. It's basically a textbook style guide to help you benchmark your data. So we've got lots of screenshots to help guide your entry, just a different tool for you guys to use. Also, if you do have specific situations like multifamily that you have a question on, or solar generation because you're over generating and you need to take additional steps, all of those details are in this reference guide. Most of you can just use the training videos, but if you do have a little more complicated situation, this guide is here for you as well. And then I'll just quickly show you, there is an SDG&E benchmarking user guide that we've provided as well. Again, textbook style, step-by-step to go through the process. But we will be getting that training video added this month on how to submit your data. So we'll talk about that briefly today, but we really encourage you to watch that training video because we're going step by step and important reminders to keep in mind as you're entering those service addresses. So I think we had a question come in, Mariah.
Yes. On the City of San Diego website, under buildings covered, if your building isn't listed, how do you get the building number?
That is a great question. So right now, you'll see contact info, this energy benchmarking at sandiego.gov. Just shoot city staff an email. Mariah or Tony will respond and get you the building number. We are currently transitioning to a different system, but right now there are a bunch of building numbers available, and city staff can assign you one if you don't already have one, and then we'll get that updated in our system as well.
And that is the only question at this time.
Perfect. Well, we'll keep going, but just another thing to point out, there is an opportunity to sign up for benchmarking notifications. So for those of you who aren't a direct building owner representative, if you want to make sure you're getting City of San Diego notifications about their ordinance, please go to sandiego.gov/benchmarking and fill out the form, and you'll be added to the sign up list. And there will be changes coming to the website over the next few months. So if you do have trouble finding anything, just don't hesitate to reach out. City staff would be happy to point you in the right direction. So before we go back to the slide deck, there are just a couple things you need to do in Portfolio Manager to sync with SDG&E. So syncing with SDG&E, basically think about it like Facebook and adding a friend and sharing content with that friend. You need to be friends first. So we're going to add SDG&E as a contact in Portfolio Manager by clicking this contacts link up in the upper right-hand corner and searching for SDGE account. So it's SDGE space benchmarking. And again, there's going to be a training video that goes through all of this step by step. We just want to give you a quick preview today. Click search for new contacts. And in our case, it's not going to show up because I'm already connected. But if you go back in my address book, you'll see, where is it? Somewhere in here. Got quite a few contacts. Let me just. So here you'll see that I'm already connected. If you're not already connected, you'll actually see, and I'll just show you a preview with, you'll see a connect button that you will click, accept the terms, and you'll be able to share your property with SDG&E. Again, I highly recommend you search SDGE space benchmarking instead of having to sort through all of the many contacts that are with SDG&E. And then once you've shared or sent a connection request, it takes a couple minutes for that to process, and then you can share your property. So the reason you need to do this in Portfolio Manager before going to SDG&E's system is because SDG&E needs permission to write data to your property. So that's what we're giving them right now. So by going to the sharing tab, we can click share edit access to a property to give SDG&E those permissions. So I recommend you set up all your properties first. So you just have to do this one time. And then if you do benchmark individual meters to do that request, make sure you have that all set up before you send this request. Otherwise, you'll have to share those additional meters. So we're just going to choose our one property, but you can choose multiple properties to share. You'll scroll down. Most of you will just have SDG&E in your address book and not all of these contacts. So you'll just choose that. And then you're going to choose the second option, personalized sharing and exchange data. That exchange data is really important because that allows them to write information to your property and Portfolio Manager. We'll click continue. And then under exchange data, we're just going to click this radio button. And then we're going to give full access to the meters that are applicable. So solar, water, waste will have this little not cross out symbol because they don't sync with that. They only sync electric and gas. And then goals and recognition, you choose none. And share forward, you choose no. That just prevents SDG&E from sharing your property with somebody else. You'll click apply selections and authorize exchange and then share properties. And then you'll see a green notification box that you've successfully shared your property. You can see in the notifications that the sharing request has been sent. And if we refresh the page, we'll see that the share's already been accepted. Sometimes it can be a little bit of a lag, like a few minutes or so. But as soon as you get these notification messages, you can proceed with syncing with SDG&E. We're going to switch back to the slides in just a minute, but I just wanted to show you SDG&E's benchmarking website. We have some screenshots in the slide deck. The video actually goes through this whole thing, but this is their main page, sdge.com/benchmarking. And on number 2 is where you would go to start your request. But before you do any of this, you need to share your property in Portfolio Manager. Otherwise, when you put in your username, it's not going to find anything. So with that, we can switch back to the slide deck. And while we're doing that, Mariah, I think another question came in.
Yes. If you have 14 electric meters for one building, can SDG&E automatically upload all 14 meters individually, or does the upload combine all 14 meters in one group?
So if those are tenant meters and you do not have letter of authorization on file for all of those meters, you will just get something called total electric that will include all 14 meters, and that's for privacy protection reasons. Now, if because of your lease you have green leasing terminology in there that provides you access with tenant data, or you have letter of authorization, you can actually file those with the consent to share program, and then you can get that individual data. But if we're talking about just residential apartment tenants, you probably don't have that available, so you will just get one total aggregate amount.
Okay, and he adds all 14 meters are paid by the landlord. Does that affect anything?
Yes, then you can, if you're the SDG&E account owner, you can benchmark them individually in what's called a non-aggregated request and have the consumption data synced. It will only sync consumption data. So when we get back to the slides, we'll talk about that a little more. So as I was just mentioning, there's something called a non-aggregated request and an aggregated request that you can do from SDG&E. So those 14 meters that you own can be done either way, either a non-aggregated request or aggregated. Non-aggregated means you're getting monthly data for each individual meter. You have to have the account number, meter number, and last bill amount for all of those meters, and you'll verify them in the SDG&E system. If any of those are a tenant meter that you are not the SDG&E account owner on record, you would need a letter of authorization. But both of them are requested through this same process. The aggregated data is the more common situation for most of you. It's whole building monthly meter data, gas and electric, aggregated per building or per multifamily property. You must meet the aggregation thresholds, 3 or more for only commercial. That bumps up to 5 or more if there is a multifamily, any residential. It gives data for all of the meters in the buildings, including tenants, without that letter of authorization, as long as you meet those thresholds. And that's requested through the website we just showed. So how do you decide, I want to just do this manually versus doing the automatic, whether aggregated or non-aggregated uploads with SDG&E? So some of you don't have a choice. If you need aggregated data, you have to sync with SDG&E. There's no other option. But for those of you like the building owner who just messaged, has 14 of their own meters, you have a choice whether you want to sync that with SDG&E or do manual uploads. Now, I really recommend manual uploads if you have a more manageable number of meters, say under 5, but you could certainly do it with 14 or 20 if you wanted to. Some of the benefits for manual uploads, there's no additional connections. So what we showed you today so far is all you have to do. You don't even have to share your property with SDG&E. You can also track cost and demand data and demand cost in addition to consumption, which is something you can't get if you sync with SDG&E. So some people find that information very useful, and maybe you have an intern on staff who's doing the manual data entry and you don't care, you just want the data, that's fine. You can get your meter entries by billing period. If you sync with SDG&E, they'll be by calendar month, so it's a little harder to match up your consumption each month without going to SDG&E's website. But again, this is only for individual meter by meter data that you own, that you even have the option to do manual. If you have to aggregate tenant electric meters or gas meters, you have to go with the automatic SDG&E uploads. That does require connecting with SDG&E, so sharing in Portfolio Manager and then accessing this additional steps that we'll touch on. It will upload meter entries by calendar month, so it's a little different, but it can do aggregated and non-aggregated requests, and you don't have that manual data entry. So the choice is yours. If you have it, if you're doing aggregated, you'll just sync with SDG&E. But unless you're required to do it so you access data, if you own all your meters, it's up to you how you want to approach it. So again, even if you don't need to comply under Assembly Bill 802 or the city's ordinance, you can still request this data if you meet these thresholds. So I just really want to drive that point home, that even if you're not required to report, if you want to benchmark as a best practice, definitely take advantage of this data access provision. So diving back into those scenarios we talked about earlier, they do have implications for how you sync with SDG&E. So if you remember, scenario 1, you have to set up a bunch of different properties from the get-go. But with this option, you would put each building's address as its SDG&E service address, and it wouldn't require you to do any additional steps in the benchmarking data request portal. The main exception is if one of these buildings has two service addresses, say building 1 is 123 Main Street and 234 B Street, you would still have to add and associate that additional service address in SDG&E's portal. So this might help influence which scenario you approach, but just keep in mind that in most cases, if you do take the work upfront to benchmark each building separately with all of their separate service addresses, you probably don't have to do any additional associations in SDG&E's tool. So in scenario 2, we just had our apartment complex, and say we just use the leasing office address that's at 123 Main Street as the address for the entire property. So in SDG&E's portal, they're only going to see that 123 Main Street as the service address coming through, and it's only going to automatically pull data from those meters unless you associate every other service address for your property. So if you have 4 buildings and 4 additional service addresses, you have to enter each of those 4 service addresses in SDG&E's system, or you won't receive all the energy usage for the property. So this goes back to where I told you, you really should create an Excel with your account number, meter number, and service address. That way you can check in the SDG&E system that you have all meters per service address that you're expecting to receive to make sure you're not missing any information. One thing to note when we're talking about separate service addresses, we're talking about separate physical addresses and street numbers. So 123 Main Street and 234 B Street. If it's 123 Main Street, Suite A, Suite B, Suite C, or Apartment 1, Apartment 2, Apartment 3, it will pull those. It just won't pull it if it's a separate street number and or street name. So a couple things to keep in mind when you're choosing different scenarios. Again, either one is acceptable. It's what it works best for your situation. And just some things to keep in mind when you're submitting your request through SDG&E's portal so you get all of your data. So we already talked about this. The data request portal, you can click the link to start your request. And we'll just briefly touch on these. I really encourage you to check out the SDG&E data request user guide on the City of San Diego's website. The one on SDG&E's website, I think, hasn't been updated yet, so definitely go to the city's website to get that. And then by the end of the month, we'll have that training video up for you guys that goes through each of these things step by step. It'll be about 15 minutes long, but you can pause and go along as you're doing it to make sure you're doing it correctly. And the idea is once you set this up, unless you have new service addresses coming online, all of your meters should continue syncing going forward. So you have this bigger lift to set it up this year, and then next year you just check that all your data's there and no major use details have changed. So step 1, you'll indicate who you are. If you're not the building owner and you're a third party, make sure you first go to the SDG&E's consent to share and you have a valid letter of authorization on file to act on behalf of the building owner. That way I can't just go and say, I want the Bank of America building's energy data and I have no connection to the building. So that's a privacy measure to make sure your data is secure. Step 2, we skipped over. It's just literally putting in your contact details. Step 3, you will put in your building information. So here's where you can choose aggregated or non-aggregated. Remember, if you do need tenant data aggregated and you don't have individual letters of authorization, you have to choose aggregated. Also, make sure you change the frequency of the request to recurring. That means it'll continue uploading month after month. Delivery method, you can choose Portfolio Manager or a download. Again, we recommend Portfolio Manager because that's directly getting your data into the system. And another thing for your username, you'll use whatever username created the property. So you might have to check back on the details tab of the property to see what username that is, but that'll pull in all properties under that username. Before we go on, I think a question came in, Mariah.
Yes, can you show where the portal is located again, or how to access the data request portal?
Yes, so it's sdge.com/benchmarking, and you can either click start your benchmarking request or the portal link. If we go back a couple slides, so yeah, on this page you can click either the link under number 2 or that actual link to the portal in the first paragraph. This is a hyperlink, so it'll take you to sdge.com/benchmarking, and that's where you'll go to submit your request.
Perfect, thank you. And then one more question. I have finished being authorized by SDG&E benchmarking data requests for all 14 meters for my building. Will they upload consumption for last year or only data starting from the request date forward?
That's a great question. So it differs based on your type of request. So non-aggregated, and I highly encourage you to watch the benchmarking training video when it's available or check out the reference guide. When you're submitting your request, you actually have the opportunity for non-aggregated to change that period back to 3 years from today's date. So it's June 2020, so you can actually go back to June of 2017 and it'll upload all that historical data. For aggregated requests, it'll default to January 1st of the prior year, and that's as far back as you can go. So if you're doing your request for the first time in 2020, it'll default to January 1st, 2019. So yeah, you can get historical data. And then just making sure you choose recurring to continue getting those uploads. So once you have chosen your request type and click retrieve shared properties, you'll pull up all your properties associated with the account. So in this case, we just have our test property. You would click on the address to associate additional service addresses. If you have a parent property and children property, you'll actually see all the children property and all of the service addresses listed here. You'll also see a count of the meters. In order to check the meters, you would click on the test office property or your property name, and it'll bring up a dialog box where you can see all of the meters that are currently associated with your property. And that's where that spreadsheet comes in handy to check that you have all the meters you should. So once you've verified everything, it's not on the screen, but there's a next button. Customer authorization, if you have multiple electric meters, but one house gas meter, or if you're doing a non-aggregated request, you would click on the property name here. It'll bring up a dialog box where you would add that meter trio information, which is your account number, your meter number, and your last bill amount. And that's the last bill amount for the entire account, not just an individual meter. Again, the training video goes through this step by step, but it's definitely important to just check, especially if it says there are 2 accounts requiring authorization, and make sure you validate those or your request might not be completed and you'll hear back from SDG&E that they need more information. After you've validated the meters, you can review everything. You can go back if you need to update your request details if something doesn't look right. Otherwise, you can proceed and click next, and you'll receive a confirmation. So you'll get a confirmation number, and you should receive a PDF download of your application. If you don't receive the PDF download, definitely reach out to SDG&E. It's actually benchmarking@sdge.com. This email works as well, but they'll be able to help troubleshoot your request. So anytime you have questions specifically related to your request didn't go through, or you check the status of your request and it said canceled, contact SDG&E directly. City staff and the benchmarking coach program are happy to help troubleshoot, but at the end of the day, it's SDG&E's system. So if it's something specifically related to this request, we encourage you to reach out directly to SDG&E to get that information and to resolve any validation issues that may be occurring. So just briefly want to talk about resources, and then we'll get to the final questions. We have about 7 minutes left. So next slide. Before we do, we want to reach out to see if you anticipate issues submitting your 2020 report due to COVID. The City of San Diego has extended their deadline to September 1st, but we just want to understand the impacts people are having because of COVID. So just yes, no, not sure. So we'll give you guys a couple of seconds to respond to that. Oh, so we got a mix here. So thank you guys for responding. And I think we have one more poll question coming up before we wrap up. Okay, after today, how familiar are you with building benchmarking using Portfolio Manager in the city's benchmarking ordinance? So just comparing, again, similar rankings, extremely familiar down to not at all familiar. So just respond and then we'll review the results and get you guys linked to those resources. Just give you guys a couple more minutes to respond. And we really thank you guys for participating in these polls. It helps get us valuable feedback about our webinars that we're doing. Great. This is a great result. I love seeing all of you who were not at all familiar being moved up to the different categories. So thank you guys for the feedback, and we'll get you in coordination with the resources that are available. So here's a link to a lot of different things we were talking about today. The data collection worksheet, the City of San Diego's benchmarking website. We also have the state's website in case some of you have properties outside of the City of San Diego. SDG&E's portal where you do submit that request, and the benchmarking coach program, as well as a link to Portfolio Manager. I also gathered a bunch of multifamily resources, campus, just Energy Stars General, multifamily FAQ, a couple case studies for you guys, and some DOE and ACEEE resources. So definitely encourage you guys to check those out if you have time, and I hope you find them useful. And then I've been mentioning this throughout the program, but CSE on behalf of the San Diego Regional Energy Partnership does provide one-on-one, no-cost technical support to building owners and operators wanting to benchmarking through the Regional Green Business Network. It's okay, you can go next, Sophie. So we can help you every step of the process, creating an account, sharing your information, adding those meters, generating reports. So we're happy to help answer any technical questions on how to benchmark. We also have a website with a lot of different resources and case studies on there. We do have a multifamily case study as well as some commercial. So definitely encourage you guys to take a look, check that out. And if you haven't joined the Regional Green Business Network, we have a lot of great webinars. There's actually one tomorrow on energy rebates from SDG&E. It's a quick 30-minute webinar, so you can go to the events tab and sign up for that. So definitely encourage you to check it out. So the benchmarking coach website is greenbizsd.org/benchmarking. You can also just access the main Regional Green Business Network website from there. If you need help, you can email us at benchmarking@greenbizsd.org. We'll be happy to get to your request or point you in the right direction of a resource that can assist. And with that, I think we might have had a final Q&A for the last couple of minutes, or did we get those answered?
One of them was answered, but let me know if that didn't answer your question, Carol. This one is for Tony, I think, and otherwise we at the city might be able to find more information. But Tony, I think you might know, can the City of San Diego water meter bills be automatically uploaded like the electric meters can be by SDG&E? Okay, and okay, Gregory, I'll follow up with you. I'll check on that and we'll shoot you in. Well, if you don't mind shooting an email to the energy benchmarking email address just so that we have your contact information, and we will get that question answered for you.
I'm sorry about that. I had my phone on mute. I was talking, but I wasn't going through. At this time, our public utilities department is not doing that. It's something we were working on, but at this point, we are not.
And just to add to that, it's very common, even across the nation, that these benchmarking policies don't include water because a lot of water utilities don't have that capability yet to do the automated uploads.
Perfect. Thank you both. One more question has come in. When submitting our application through the City of San Diego, does that qualify for the state requirement?
Yes, that's a great question. So by reporting to the state, the city will report to the state on your behalf. So you only need to report to your local jurisdiction. That also goes for LA, Berkeley, San Jose, San Francisco, other jurisdictions with a local ordinance in place in California. So as long as you're reporting to a local jurisdiction that has an exempted ordinance, which you can check out on the state's website, you do not need to do anything with the state. If you do have properties that are both in San Diego, City of San Diego, and outside of the City of San Diego, the ones that are outside of the City of San Diego would still need to report to the state. The process is very similar. You would just go to the state's website to get the reporting link versus the city's.
Perfect. Thank you. And that is the last question at this time.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much for joining. I encourage you to check out the resources on the City of San Diego's website. Reach out if you have questions. You do have some additional time now through September 1st to get those reports submitted. So definitely reach out if you have questions. And thank you guys for attending today's webinar.